At 6:18 on a Monday morning, the security camera at Ridgeview Estates tilted 3 inches to the left, and by 6:23, a massive crack opened completely across the visitor lane. By 6:31, a massive section of pavement, curb, landscaping, and the camera pedestal had violently dropped into a muddy hole nearly 6 feet deep, directly beside the HOA's new $300,000 entrance. Nobody was physically hurt, but that was honestly the absolute only lucky part of the entire disaster. My name is Daniel Brooks. I was 51 years old, and I proudly owned 14 acres, sitting right beside the east entrance of Ridgeview Estates in eastern Tennessee. For 18 quiet years, a shallow sandy depression had run peacefully along the very edge of my property, and while most people simply saw a useless ditch, I knew it as the exact place where the massive hillside water safely disappeared. In wet weather, clear seepage came running down through the steep slope completely above us, safely spread across that low strip, and moved incredibly slowly through the thick sand and gravel. It perfectly soaked straight into the ground, instead of dangerously concentrating directly at the main road, and the original developer knew exactly what it was. One of the old, dusty drainage drawings explicitly described it in just 6 undeniable words: maintain existing sandy swale as distributed infiltration area. Another crucial engineering note was even vastly more specific, strongly warning the builders not to concentrate hillside seepage at the east entrance. Ridgeview Estates arrogantly paved directly over it anyway, entirely because HOA President Karen Whitmore desperately wanted a significantly wider visitor lane, lavish decorative stone columns, massive automatic gates, pristine new lighting, and a massive camera island that would make the entrance look incredibly expensive. Their own experienced contractor explicitly warned them that completely removing the vital swale absolutely required installing another expensive drainage system, and I personally warned them too. Their own civil consultant accurately priced a proper underdrain and massive infiltration system at roughly $38,000, but Karen immediately rejected it. Her arrogant internal email later became the absolute most famous sentence in the entire neighborhood. "We are absolutely not spending another $38,000 to drain useless sand. Just pave it and finish the entrance." Exactly 5 months later, the massive entrance lane completely collapsed, and Karen immediately suggested that my property somehow possessed some massive, hidden geological defect that absolutely nobody could have possibly predicted. But then the strict county engineer found the ancient plans. The terrified insurer quickly found the contractor's explicit written warning, and the independent geotechnical team found a massive, leaking storm pipe connection directly below the exact location where the HOA's dangerous redesign had violently concentrated all the water. The porous limestone deep under Ridgeview had technically always made a subsurface void entirely possible, but the county's devastating final summary perfectly explained the disaster in a way absolutely everyone could understand. The geology naturally created the slight weakness, but the arrogant HOA had blindly given millions of gallons of water a direct, violent path to instantly enlarge it. I bought my sweeping property long before Ridgeview Estates ever looked the lavish way it did later. Back then, the quiet subdivision had only one phase, completely fewer than 40 simple homes, and a remarkably simple wooden entrance sign sitting peacefully right beside my land on the downslope side of a heavily wooded ridge. I ran a modest, small irrigation and pump repair business, and while it was absolutely nothing glamorous, I spent my long days meticulously fixing high-pressure tanks, constantly replacing control valves, endlessly tracing hidden leaks, and desperately trying to accurately explain to homeowners exactly why heavy water absolutely always takes the easiest physical path available. While that technical background absolutely did not make me a licensed civil engineer, after spending 18 observant years on the exact same property, I had carefully watched absolutely every heavy storm that ever crossed that steep slope. I knew exactly which part of the massive field stayed perfectly dry. I knew exactly where the deep springs suddenly appeared right after a heavily wet winter. And I definitively knew that sandy swale had absolutely never been a mere decorative feature. My late father had happily helped me completely clear the massive property when I very first bought it, and he actually wanted to completely fill the low strip simply because it visually looked slightly unfinished. An older, highly experienced county technician, who just happened to be checking a nearby culvert, firmly told us absolutely not to touch it, explaining that the original developer had highly intentionally left the thick sandy material perfectly in place. So we did exactly that, and over the countless years, I happily planted soft grass entirely around it, but absolutely never blocked it, ensuring that during severe storms, the massive water spread completely out instead of aggressively cutting a dangerous channel. By the time the rushing water finally reached the deep roadside ditch, the heavy flow was significantly slower and vastly safer. Meanwhile, Ridgeview rapidly expanded right behind me, as 40 simple homes quickly became vastly more than 100. Then came the lavish clubhouse, the massive pool, the towering decorative walls, and eventually a highly arrogant board that wildly cared vastly more about the expensive appearance of the grand entrance than the vital, ancient engineering safely standing right behind it. Karen became the new president right during a contentious period when the angry residents were constantly complaining that the main gate looked incredibly outdated. She was absolutely not incompetent by any means, and that was exactly what made the escalating conflict so incredibly frustrating. She was highly organized, wildly decisive, and incredibly good at getting massive projects instantly approved, and she aggressively pushed through a massive $300,000 entrance modernization package that the residents had desperately wanted for years. The lavish architectural renderings looked incredibly impressive, proudly featuring towering stone columns, massive black steel gates, perfectly separate resident and visitor lanes, high-tech license plate cameras, beautiful landscape lighting, gorgeous new trees, and a pristine small guard kiosk. The absolute massive problem only truly appeared when the arrogant board wildly widened the massive entrance directly toward my private side, because their lavish conceptual drawing completely treated my vital sandy swale as an entirely empty, useless shoulder. Then I suddenly saw bright orange construction stakes aggressively extending vastly past my strict fence line, so I immediately emailed the property manager to demand an explanation. He arrogantly told me the HOA possessed strict drainage rights completely along that side of the massive subdivision, which was actually only partly true. A legally recorded stormwater easement absolutely existed on the books, but it was incredibly strictly a preservation and maintenance easement, meaning it legally allowed safe access purely to meticulously maintain the existing drainage function. It absolutely did not magically transfer the actual ownership of the land, and it absolutely did not say the arrogant HOA could violently convert my vital infiltration area straight into a massive asphalt traffic lane. I calmly tried to completely explain that vital legal distinction long before expensive lawyers ever needed to become heavily involved. Karen arrogantly responded that the massive project was a vital community safety improvement, and she coldly claimed that the existing dirty ditch would simply be properly modernized. That specific, ignorant word deeply bothered me, because the vital swale absolutely did not need any foolish modernization. It desperately needed to remain completely porous. If you currently own land right beside a massive subdivision, an active drainage easement, a roaring creek, a vital culvert, or absolutely any stormwater facility, always save the boring old plats and the ancient engineering plans. The seemingly useless feature that looks completely boring on a beautiful sunny afternoon may actually be doing its absolute most important, life-saving job during the absolute worst, terrifying hour of a massive storm. And if you have ever wildly seen somebody blindly improve a property by maliciously removing the very thing completely protecting it, tell me down in the comments, and share this wild story with absolutely someone who currently owns low ground. Just one single week later, a massive heavy excavator violently scraped the very first vital layer of deep sand completely away, and that was the exact moment I completely stopped trying to nicely settle the massive issue with friendly, polite emails. The massive paving contractor was called Summit Siteworks, and their experienced foreman, a man named Mike, was actually significantly more cautious than the arrogant board. When I calmly showed him my officially recorded plat, he instantly stopped the massive excavator long enough to frantically call his main office. Just 2 days later, Summit formally sent the HOA a strict request for information, explicitly stating that the planned paving aggressively removed an existing, vital infiltration feature and asking whether an alternate, safe subsurface drainage system had been properly designed. Their own highly experienced civil consultant quickly proposed a massive perforated underdrain, a heavy stone trench, multiple cleanouts, and a highly controlled overflow connection with an estimated change order of roughly $38,000. Karen instantly and arrogantly rejected the massive change order, and the aggressive construction blindly resumed. The vital sandy surface was brutally compacted. A massive heavy stone base went violently down, and then came the incredibly thick, impenetrable asphalt. A massive new concrete curb was aggressively installed strictly along the steep uphill edge, and that rigid curb instantly created a completely new, terrifying problem. Millions of gallons of violent water that had once safely spread entirely across 20 or 30 feet of highly porous ground now possessed significantly fewer safe places to instantly go. During incredibly heavy rain, the massive runoff violently followed the brand new pavement straight toward one single, completely overwhelmed catch basin right near the new visitor gate. I meticulously took countless high-definition photographs strictly during absolutely every major stage of the massive build. This was absolutely not because I was simply sitting around happily waiting for a massive disaster, but purely because my brilliant defense attorney, Rachel Sloan, explicitly told me to heavily document exactly what the arrogant board changed. She immediately hired my highly trusted licensed surveyor, Megan Price, who flawlessly recovered the legally recorded property corners and perfectly confirmed that the violently widened lane aggressively crossed onto my private parcel by significantly more than 14 feet at its absolute deepest point. The panicked HOA immediately answered with the recorded drainage easement, so Rachel ruthlessly answered right back with its exact, undeniable legal language. The strict easement purely permitted the careful inspection, routine maintenance, and simple repair of the existing drainage facilities. It absolutely did not ever authorize the massive construction of an entirely additional, heavily paved traffic lane. That incredibly strict legal distinction absolutely should have been vastly more than enough to completely stop the entire western edge of the massive project entirely in its tracks. But it wildly was not, as the completely arrogant board foolishly argued that the massive new paving actually magically improved their vital access to the deep drainage system. Then, another specialized contractor suddenly discovered something infinitely vastly more serious, hiding deep in the dirt. While aggressively installing thick electrical conduit directly for the massive camera pedestal, the exhausted workers accidentally exposed a large part of a massive, significantly older storm line actively running deeply beneath the lavish entrance. While the heavy pipe itself was absolutely not failing, a massive, critical joint right near the new security island clearly showed heavy staining and undeniable evidence of dangerous, long-term seepage. Mike heavily recommended a thorough, expensive camera inspection long before the massive new lane was ever finalized, but Karen absolutely did not want another expensive delay. Founders' Weekend was rapidly approaching, and the arrogant board had already proudly announced the lavish new entrance would completely reopen perfectly before the massive event. The vital pipe inspection was maliciously postponed, the incredibly thick asphalt violently went down, and the massive new gate opened perfectly on the exact schedule. For several quiet weeks, it actually looked completely like arrogant Karen had completely won the massive battle. The excited residents absolutely loved the massive upgrade. At night, the towering stone columns beautifully glowed right under warm landscape lights. The expensive high-tech cameras flawlessly worked, and the busy visitors finally had their incredibly own, perfectly paved lane. The vital sandy strip right beside my quiet property was completely gone. But then we suddenly got our very first series of incredibly heavy rains. A highly suspicious, shallow depression suddenly appeared right near the new visitor gate, and while it was barely noticeable at maybe half an inch deep, the panicked maintenance crew quickly patched it up. Just 3 short weeks later, the terrifying depression aggressively returned, and this time, a massive hairline crack, violently curved directly from the struggling catch basin, straight toward the heavy camera pedestal. The massive automatic gate arm also suddenly stopped lining up perfectly with its expensive receiver, so I instantly sent all my damning photographs directly to Rachel. She instantly forwarded them directly to the HOA attorney and aggressively requested an immediate, incredibly thorough subsurface evaluation. Summit Siteworks quickly sent another highly urgent note, heavily recommending a massive geotechnical review. But Karen's arrogant response, which we successfully obtained significantly later, was chillingly short. Patch it right now. We can actively investigate after the busy season is over. The terrified maintenance crew quickly placed entirely another heavy asphalt patch, and the massive crack mysteriously disappeared for exactly 12 quiet days. Then the massive, incredibly heavy pavement violently began actively sinking all over again. At that exact point, I aggressively hired an incredibly brilliant, independent civil engineer named Laura Benton. Laura absolutely did not instantly tell me there was definitively a massive sinkhole hiding directly beneath the lavish gate, because she was incredibly, professionally careful. Eastern Tennessee absolutely has massive areas of highly karst-prone, porous limestone. But absolutely not every single tiny depression instantly means a giant, apocalyptic cavity. Dangerous settlement can easily come from incredibly poor compaction, a massive leaking pipe, incredibly soft soil, an aggressive washout, or even several terrifying things happening all at once. She meticulously reviewed the entire site, strictly from my private property and the completely public road, simply because the highly arrogant HOA would absolutely not give her legal permission to ever enter the actual entrance area. What deeply concerned her was the massive, undeniable water pattern. Long before the aggressive paving, the massive hillside seepage had always safely spread entirely through the porous, sandy swale. After the aggressive paving, the massive new curb and the thick lane violently directed vastly more of that heavy water straight toward the tiny catch basin and the heavily leaking, significantly older storm connection. Her devastating written opinion explicitly stated that the massive redesign appeared to have completely replaced safe, distributed infiltration with highly dangerous, violently concentrated flow entirely without a single documented alternate subsurface system. Then Rachel aggressively went straight to the dusty county records office, fully knowing the original Ridgeview development file was almost exactly 20 years old. While some massive sheets were scanned incredibly badly, and others existed strictly only as heavily archived PDFs, the massive, undeniable drainage plan was sitting completely right there. So was an incredibly terrifying geotechnical note, actively describing heavily weathered limestone deeply beneath massive portions of the exact east entrance. The original developer had absolutely not called the massive area completely unsafe. It simply highly recognized that strictly controlling highly concentrated infiltration was absolutely, critically important. Then we suddenly found the exact, massive line that perfectly connected absolutely everything. Do absolutely not concentrate heavy hillside seepage at the east entrance. The original, brilliant designer had explicitly built the massive sandy swale for exactly that specific, life-saving reason. Rachel heavily requested the arrogant HOA's entire internal project documents completely through the formal, strict public records process. The terrified board quickly produced the massive consultant request for information, the desperate $38,000 alternate drainage option, and Karen's arrogant, devastating rejection. Then came Summit's urgent later recommendation to completely inspect the ancient pipe right after the heavy staining first appeared, perfectly proving that the vital inspection had been maliciously deferred entirely by the board. The massive mountain of evidence was rapidly becoming incredibly uncomfortable for them, but I honestly still did not completely know exactly what was violently happening deep underground. Then a terrified homeowner secretly sent me incredible doorbell footage, captured directly from straight across the quiet street. During an incredibly hard, violent rain, massive sheets of water violently ran directly along the brand-new curb, exactly like a raging, narrow stream. It aggressively entered the overwhelmed catch basin, vastly fast enough to instantly create a massive, visible whirl right at the heavy steel grate. At nearly the exact same terrifying time, dark water was violently seeping straight up through a massive joint, directly in the thick asphalt, just 15 feet away. Laura intensely watched the incredible video twice, and her massive, terrifying professional concern was that millions of gallons of water might be aggressively moving straight into the soft soil entirely around the older storm connection, violently carrying incredibly fine material completely away over time. That highly destructive process is scientifically called internal erosion, or massive soil piping, and strictly in karst terrain, it can violently and rapidly enlarge already existing deep voids or massive weak zones. The very next aggressive step was absolutely not petty revenge. It was a massive, ironclad legal demand for an immediate, thorough inspection. Rachel instantly sent the panicked HOA a highly formal notice, meticulously attaching the precise survey, the ironclad original drainage plan, the massive photographs, the devastating engineering opinion, and the terrified contractor warnings. We aggressively asked them to completely close the highly dangerous visitor lane entirely until a massive geotechnical evaluation was fully completed. The terrified HOA attorney weakly acknowledged the massive legal letter, but the highly dangerous lane incredibly stayed completely open. Karen arrogantly sent the worried residents a completely dismissive message, falsely claiming that any wild rumors about a highly dangerous entrance were massively exaggerated, and that incredibly minor pavement settlement had already been perfectly repaired. Then the terrifying regional forecast violently showed entirely another massive, multi-day heavy rain system aggressively moving right in. Laura urgently emailed me exactly one single, terrifying sentence. If the massive depression drastically changes right after this severe storm, absolutely stay completely away from the dangerous entrance and instantly call the strict county authorities. The violent rain completely began late Saturday night, and by Sunday evening, vastly more than 4 heavy inches had violently fallen completely across massive parts of the upper watershed. I could incredibly easily hear massive torrents of water violently running directly beside the main road, straight from my quiet porch. At exactly 5:50 Monday morning, I carefully walked straight toward my quiet mailbox. The lavish entrance lights were actually still brightly on, and the incredibly thick pavement actually looked entirely dark and perfectly smooth. Then I suddenly noticed the massive, incredibly heavy camera pedestal was violently leaning. I quickly went right back inside and instantly called the strict county emergency line to report a massive roadway hazard. Exactly 28 terrifying minutes later, the massive ground violently opened. The massive collapse absolutely did not violently happen exactly like some giant movie explosion. It terrifyingly happened in incredibly slow, violent stages. First, the massive curved crack aggressively widened, and then a massive section of thick curb violently dropped several incredibly deep inches. A terrified security guard instantly closed the dangerous visitor lane, and that single, brilliant split-second decision absolutely, definitively, probably completely prevented a massive injury or horrific death. The panicked guard had barely, frantically moved the heavy orange cones safely into place when the incredibly thick pavement violently settled deeply again. The incredibly heavy camera pedestal violently tilted incredibly sharply, and a massive, lavish, landscaped bed violently broke completely along one single side. Then the incredibly thick asphalt aggressively fractured, and a massive section roughly the exact size of a heavy pickup truck violently dropped completely into a massive, terrifyingly deep, muddy cavity. Millions of gallons of violent water aggressively rushed straight through the highly exposed, vulnerable soil, and the massive hole violently deepened entirely until the absolute lowest visible point was incredibly about 6 terrifying feet, entirely below the massive original pavement. The massive main resident lane incredibly remained completely intact, but the incredibly heavy automatic gate frame violently shifted vastly enough that it absolutely could not ever safely operate normally again. The highly expensive entrance was effectively, completely crippled. Strict county engineering staff instantly arrived on the chaotic scene, and then the terrified HOA's heavy insurer quickly sent a highly specialized, expensive emergency response consultant. Summit Siteworks quickly came rushing back with its entire damming project file, while a highly advanced geotechnical firm instantly began aggressively boring and deeply probing entirely around the heavily affected area. Their final, devastating findings were vastly more complicated than arrogant Karen ever desperately wanted, and infinitely vastly more precise than I honestly ever expected. The deep, ancient limestone entirely below the expensive entrance was heavily weathered and incredibly locally irregular, and that terrifying geologic condition absolutely existed long before the massive HOA project ever even began. There was also undeniable physical evidence that the significantly older storm pipe joint had actively, heavily leaked for years. But the incredibly arrogant new site configuration had substantially, violently increased exactly how much massive water was aggressively being constantly concentrated right near that highly vulnerable connection. The vital swale had previously safely spread millions of gallons of seepage completely across a massive, incredibly broad area. The massive new concrete curb and incredibly thick pavement violently redirected that massive flow, completely giving that heavily leaking joint a terrifying, highly concentrated subsurface path. Incredibly fine soil violently migrated completely away, and a massive pre-existing weak zone aggressively enlarged into a terrifying monster. The massive report absolutely did not completely say Karen magically created a giant geological void completely out of nothing. It completely, devastatingly said the massive entrance modification materially, violently increased water concentration strictly in the direct vicinity of an existing storm connection and completely contributed directly to massive subsurface erosion. That specific, undeniable legal language absolutely mattered immensely. Then the strict county brilliantly compared the exact, massive failure location directly with the original, ancient drainage plan. The massive sinkhole actually sat incredibly, almost exactly where the dusty old drawing explicitly, heavily warned against violently concentrating any heavy hillside seepage. Karen wildly, desperately tried to arrogantly argue that absolutely no one could have ever magically predicted an invisible underground cavity. But the smart contractor instantly produced its devastating request for information. Brilliant Laura completely produced the ancient, undeniable plan, and ruthless Rachel instantly produced Karen's incredibly arrogant email. We are absolutely not spending another $38,000 to drain useless sand. The massive legal issue was absolutely no longer whether arrogant Karen could ever somehow perfectly predict the precise, terrifying shape of the massive hole. The incredibly devastating issue was definitively whether the arrogant board had completely been repeatedly, heavily warned, absolutely not, to ever remove a highly vital infiltration feature entirely without completely replacing its critical life-saving function. And they undeniably, explicitly had. Then came the massive, incredibly expensive property question. Megan's undeniable survey perfectly confirmed that a massive part of the heavy paved overflow area aggressively crossed completely over my strict private boundary. The arrogant HOA's recorded drainage easement absolutely allowed the standard maintenance of vital stormwater function, but the strict county engineer made completely clear that entirely covering the vital infiltration area with an incredibly heavy, impervious vehicle lane was absolutely not any kind of maintenance of that vital function. That single devastating ruling completely, violently destroyed the HOA's wildly arrogant argument that the strict easement magically gave them entirely unlimited, massive construction rights. The massive legal and incredibly technical pieces finally lined perfectly, devastatingly up. They had aggressively paved massive land they absolutely did not legally own. They had maliciously used a strict easement for something it absolutely did not ever authorize. And they had violently removed a critical drainage feature their entirely own ancient historical plans explicitly said must permanently remain. The strict county instantly restricted absolutely any permanent reconstruction completely, until Ridgeview formally submitted a massive, completely corrective drainage and incredibly strict geotechnical plan. The massive visitor lane incredibly remained completely closed, forcing the highly frustrated residents to completely use a terrible temporary traffic pattern straight through the only surviving side of the once lavish entrance. For the very first time entirely since the massive project ever began, absolutely nobody cared exactly how the lavish stone columns visually looked. Highly specialized engineers aggressively drilled incredibly deep boreholes, flawlessly mapping the exact, massive weakened zone. The heavily leaking, highly dangerous storm connection was aggressively excavated and completely, safely replaced. Exactly where incredibly appropriate, the highly specialized geotechnical contractor actively used incredibly expensive engineered fill and highly targeted, massive stabilization completely to perfectly address the terrifying voided soils. The final, incredibly expensive repair design actually did something incredibly, painfully familiar. It perfectly, flawlessly restored safe, distributed drainage. A massive part of the incredibly expensive asphalt widening was aggressively, permanently removed completely. A massive, expensive stone-filled underdrain was completely installed. Multiple new heavy cleanouts were carefully added, and a highly advanced brand-new bioswale aggressively occupied almost completely much of the exact same footprint, exactly as the vital sandy feature Karen had arrogantly called completely useless. Massive surface runoff was perfectly safely spread entirely, instead of aggressively dumped straight toward one single failing point, and the heavily repaired visitor lane was entirely moved completely right back safely onto pure HOA property. The incredibly expensive camera pedestal desperately had to be completely rebuilt from scratch. The incredibly heavy gate equipment was entirely realigned, and massive landscape walls were incredibly expensively replaced. The lavish stone columns actually survived, but almost absolutely everything entirely around them desperately had to be completely, violently disturbed. The absolutely massive cost incredibly grew terrifyingly quickly. There was massive emergency work, incredibly expensive geotechnical investigation, massive heavy pipe replacement, incredibly expensive temporary traffic control, massive drainage redesign, aggressive heavy pavement removal, incredibly expensive gate repairs, completely new landscaping, endless massive legal fees, and incredibly crushing insurance deductibles. By the time the completely terrified board finally disclosed the shockingly revised budget, the massive repair and completely associated costs had violently climbed entirely into the absolute several $100,000 range. All incredibly entirely just to completely avoid an initial, perfectly reasonable $38,000 drainage change order. The massive insurer also aggressively reviewed exactly whether fully documented, explicit warnings had completely been wildly ignored, which instantly became a massive, apocalyptic problem for the arrogant board. Summit Siteworks brilliantly avoided being ever legally treated exactly as the primary cause, completely because its ironclad file perfectly contained the massive request asking for completely alternate drainage, and the highly urgent later recommendation to completely investigate the severe settlement. The incredibly smart company had perfectly warned the arrogant HOA completely in undeniable writing, but Karen had arrogantly just desperately wanted the massive entrance finished. Rachel absolutely flawlessly settled my massive private property claim completely separately, forcing the utterly defeated HOA to immediately agree to aggressively remove absolutely all permanent heavy paving completely from my strict private parcel. My strict boundary was incredibly permanently marked, and the massive, heavily disturbed area was completely restored entirely as a vital part of the brand new infiltration design. Ridgeview entirely reimbursed all my massive survey costs, incredibly heavy engineering expenses, massive federal restoration costs, and a heavily negotiated, massive portion of all my incredibly expensive legal fees. I absolutely did not ever receive some massive, imaginary giant revenge payout, because I simply got exactly what I had patiently asked for completely from the absolute very beginning. My strict private land completely back, the vital drainage function entirely restored, and ironclad written confirmation perfectly stating that the arrogant HOA absolutely could not magically use the strict stormwater easement exactly as completely illegal permission to aggressively build a heavy traffic lane. Then the deeply furious residents aggressively requested the entire, completely massive project file, and at the very next massive board meeting, the sprawling clubhouse completely filled to the absolute brim. Arrogant Karen desperately tried to weakly explain that the massive, terrifying failure purely involved completely unpredictable, magical geology. A furious homeowner loudly asked exactly why Summit had heavily recommended an incredibly expensive alternate drainage system, while another loudly asked exactly why the ironclad original plans explicitly said absolutely not to ever violently concentrate seepage. Someone else furiously asked exactly why the incredibly arrogant board violently rejected the exact $38,000 system that actually looked incredibly, remarkably similar to exactly what the expensive engineers were completely now actively installing entirely for vastly, infinitely more money. Then the furious treasurer proudly displayed Karen's incredibly damning, undeniable email, perfectly reading, "Just pave it entirely and completely finish the entrance." The entire temperature of the incredibly packed room violently changed, because the deeply furious residents were absolutely no longer simply looking at an unavoidable, magical natural disaster. They were completely looking exactly at a terrifying chain of incredibly arrogant, malicious decisions. Karen instantly, utterly resigned completely, as president entirely in massive disgrace, long before a terrifying recall vote could ever even be scheduled. The highly reformed brand new board immediately adopted a completely ironclad policy, strictly requiring absolute written approval, completely from a highly licensed design professional, entirely before absolutely any HOA project could ever magically remove, aggressively cover, violently relocate, or completely materially alter absolutely any drainage feature. Vital stormwater designs absolutely could no longer ever be magically changed entirely through sheer arrogant board preference alone. And while that simple, brilliant rule effectively cost almost absolutely nothing to write, finally learning exactly why they desperately needed it ultimately cost an absolute, staggering fortune. Exactly 6 quiet months later, the incredibly lavish Ridgeview entrance finally perfectly reopened. The towering, lavish stone columns were actually entirely still perfectly there. The massive black gates absolutely still looked incredibly expensive, and the high-tech cameras were completely entirely new. But the vital visitor lane was completely significantly narrower than arrogant Karen had ever incredibly planned. Right perfectly beside it ran a highly beautiful, completely shallow landscape depression, entirely filled with heavy stone, completely native grass, an incredibly porous sandy soil, a highly advanced, perfectly functioning bioswale. During the very first incredibly heavy, violent rain, right after the massive reconstruction, I quietly stood perfectly safely under my quiet porch and peacefully watched millions of gallons of water perfectly spread entirely through it. There was absolutely no terrifying, highly dramatic torrent, absolutely no massive, dangerous whirlpool right at the heavy catch basin, and absolutely no terrifying, brand new massive crack aggressively curving directly across the incredibly thick asphalt. There was just completely natural heavy water perfectly slowing safely down and entirely disappearing completely across a massive broad strip of completely porous ground, which was incredibly almost exactly what the ancient, vital Swale had perfectly done for countless 18 quiet years. That was the exact, undeniable part I truly found completely deeply satisfying. Absolutely not the massive, terrifying sinkhole, and definitely not arrogant Karen utterly losing her precious presidency. Absolutely nobody should ever wildly celebrate a massive, terrifying failure that absolutely could have severely injured or horrifically killed someone. What truly mattered was that Ridgeview absolutely finally stopped ignorantly treating incredibly vital drainage entirely exactly as completely wasted, empty space. The ancient, vital sandy depression had absolutely never been incredibly pretty, lavish infrastructure. It completely had absolutely no massive expensive sign, absolutely no towering concrete walls, absolutely no massive heavy pumps, and absolutely no giant, heavy steel grate, magically large enough to completely impress absolutely anybody. It completely, simply, flawlessly gave millions of gallons of heavy water, absolutely somewhere incredibly safe to instantly go, and for 18 incredibly quiet years, that simple fact had entirely been vastly more than enough. If you currently own any strict property directly beside a massive HOA, always obsessively save your incredibly vital deed, your strict survey, all massive easements, heavy drainage drawings, strict contractor notices, and completely undeniable photographs. If somebody arrogantly tells you an incredibly vital, older drainage feature is magically completely obsolete, aggressively ask them exactly what will flawlessly replace the incredibly vital job it is actually completely already doing entirely, before they blindly cover it completely with incredibly thick pavement. If you truly think arrogant Ridgeview wildly crossed the massive legal line the exact second it completely ignored the brilliant contractor's incredibly urgent first warning, tell me completely down in the comments exactly what you think. Completely share this incredibly wild story directly with absolutely someone who currently has a massive swale, a deep ditch, a heavy culvert, a roaring creek, or an incredibly vital storm drain right anywhere entirely near their strict private property. Be absolutely sure to safely save this massive video completely, because boring drainage disputes incredibly often visually look entirely boring, right? Completely up exactly until the massive ground violently starts terrifyingly moving. And do absolutely not forget to immediately subscribe completely for vastly more incredibly satisfying stories, exactly where boring property records, massive engineering plans, and incredibly quiet, patient documentation eventually become vastly, infinitely stronger than the incredibly arrogant person who blindly thought exactly one completely more layer of thick asphalt could somehow magically solve completely, absolutely everything. Arrogant Karen foolishly thought the ancient sandy swale was completely wasted space, but the strict county engineer brilliantly proved it had been flawlessly, completely protecting the massive entrance the absolute entire time. The ancient ground absolutely did not somehow suddenly randomly forget exactly how to perfectly hold the massive gate. The arrogant HOA simply violently changed exactly where millions of gallons of water magically went.